A day in the park. The morning sun was bright, casting a soft glow across City Park, a patch of green tranquility nestled in the heart of a bustling urban landscape. Laughter from children, the rhythmic padding of joggers' feet, and the whisper of a gentle breeze filled the air, creating an atmosphere that felt untouched by the troubles of the world. The scent of freshly cut grass was everywhere, sweet and comforting. In this sea of weekend calmness, 6-year-old Amelia was a ray of pure joy, her little frame darting across the grass as she chased a red toy plane. She was full of life, with dark, springy curls that bounced with every movement, her laughter mingling with the chirps of birds overhead. Amelia's world was simple and safe, filled with love and happiness. Her father, Captain David Johnson, was not far off, keeping a protective eye on his only daughter, while trying to blend in with the casual joggers in his running gear. Unbeknownst to Amelia and her father, Officer Mark Wilson was nearby, his large German shepherd, Zeus, trotting at his side. Mark was a seasoned officer, prideful of his work, and dutifully committed to upholding law and order. However, today, he felt a nagging resentment festering inside him, a shadow of irritation at the world around him. The laughter, the freedom, the innocent enjoyment in the park. These were things Mark had become distanced from over the years, reminders of a warmth he hadn't felt in a long time. Zeus, a sleek, muscular German shepherd, was Mark's pride and joy, and the officer often joked that Zeus was more a part of him than his badge. Highly trained, Zeus was a master of obedience, loyal and fierce, sensing the subtlest commands from his handler. Today, however, Zeus seemed attuned not to the commands Mark gave, but to his rising irritation, his ears perking up every time Mark's frustration spiked. As Mark watched Amelia from afar, something about the little girl's carefree presence stirred an anger in him, one he didn't fully understand. She was laughing, running without a care, her innocence so stark against the daily grind of his life. It was as if her laughter was mocking the strict boundaries that governed his own world. His hand tightened around Zeus's leash as he watched her, his gaze dark and brooding. "Come on, girl, running around like you own the place," Mark muttered under his breath. It was an irrational thought, but in his mind, it made sense. He felt compelled to restore some order, to impose the boundaries that he lived by, the lines that this little girl seemed so blissfully unaware of. Zeus, sensing Mark's tension, grew alert. His muscles tensed, and his posture shifted, ready to act at the slightest signal. Mark, without truly thinking it through, gave a low, nearly inaudible command. "Go, Zeus," he whispered, barely loud enough for anyone to hear. In an instant, Zeus lunged forward, his powerful legs propelling him toward Amelia. The peaceful park transformed into a scene of chaos as the dog charged across the grass, his bark sharp and fierce, a sound that shattered the morning's tranquility. The joggers paused mid-stride, heads turning toward the noise, parents instinctively grabbing their children's hands as they looked on in alarm. Amelia, caught up in her game, didn't see the dog coming. She had just thrown her toy plane into the air, watching it soar, when she heard the terrifying bark. She turned around just in time to see Zeus charging at her, his eyes fixated, his movements precise and controlled. Her eyes went wide with terror, and before she could process what was happening, the dog was upon her, knocking her to the ground with a force that left her breathless. The world seemed to blur as Zeus's teeth found her arm, sinking in as he held her down. Pain, sharp and immediate, exploded in Amelia's arm as she let out a scream, a raw, desperate cry that pierced the air, sending chills through those watching. A crowd began to gather, people murmuring in shock and horror, too stunned to act. A woman on a nearby bench covered her mouth, unable to look away as she whispered, "Is no one going to stop this?" A few feet away, Officer Mark Wilson watched the scene unfold with a disturbing calmness, his face expressionless as his gaze remained fixed on the little girl struggling under the weight of his dog. In his mind, this was a lesson, a way to establish the control he so valued. The chaos of the park quieted as the crowd's attention turned solely to the scene before them. Amelia's tiny voice broke through the crowd's shock. "Help," she whimpered, her voice trembling. But her plea was met with frozen silence. Her small form was dwarfed by the massive dog, her tiny arm pinned under Zeus's unrelenting jaws. The crowd began to stir, their discomfort growing into anger. From the edge of the crowd, a jogger yelled, "Someone do something. Get that dog off her." In the midst of this horror, a familiar voice rose above the noise, a voice filled with an authority that demanded attention. "Zeus, OKFF." David Johnson, Amelia's father and a police captain, had been at the other end of the park when he heard the scream, a sound he immediately knew was his daughter's. His instincts kicked in, and he sprinted toward the scene, his heart pounding with a mixture of dread and fury. When he saw the officer's dog pinning his little girl to the ground, something within him snapped. This was not just his daughter. This was his world, his heart and soul lying there, defenseless and hurt. Without hesitation, he rushed forward, shoving Zeus off his daughter with a controlled but forceful push. The dog backed off, his growl lingering, but his obedience to David's command was immediate. David knelt beside Amelia, his heart breaking at the sight of her tear-streaked face, her small arm marked with bloodied punctures from the dog's bite. She clung to him, trembling, her eyes wide with fear, searching for reassurance in his embrace. "Daddy, it hurts," she whispered, her voice barely audible. David's hand shook as he held her, his rage barely contained. He knew he had to keep calm for her sake, but the fury boiling within him was overwhelming. He looked up at Mark, whose expression remained disturbingly indifferent, his arms crossed as he watched without a hint of remorse. David rose slowly, placing Amelia gently behind him. His gaze was locked onto Mark, and the crowd sensed that something profound and inevitable was about to happen. "What the hell were you thinking?" David's voice was low, measured, but the anger beneath it was unmistakable, a force that made even the bystanders step back. Mark hesitated, his authority now under a shadow he hadn't anticipated. He muttered defensively. She was acting suspicious. "I followed procedure." David's hand clenched into a fist, his self-control stretched to its limits. "Procedure." His voice rose, the word heavy with disbelief. "My 6-year-old daughter. This is what you call procedure." The crowd murmured in agreement, their sympathies firmly aligned with David and his daughter. Mark's attempt at rationalizing his actions only fanned the flames of anger and disbelief among the onlookers, many of whom began recording the confrontation on their phones. David's face tightened as he glanced at Amelia, her small frame still trembling. The protective instinct within him was primal, fierce. He turned back to Mark, stepping forward, his voice now a whisper that only Mark could hear, laced with a promise that cut through the air like a blade. "This isn't over," he said, his words cold and deliberate. "You're going to pay for this. I swear it." The chapter ended with a haunting silence, the crowd watching as the intensity of David's fury set the stage for the storm yet to come. The aftermath. The echoes of Amelia's cries still lingered in the air as David cradled his daughter, a mix of relief and unbridled rage twisting his expression. The onlookers' initial shock had turned to hushed outrage, murmurs spreading through the crowd like wildfire. Some shouted at Officer Mark, demanding answers, while others held up their phones, capturing every second of the heated exchange. Mark's indifference was now unraveling under the weight of public scrutiny, and for the first time, he looked genuinely unsettled. Paramedics arrived on the scene, weaving through the gathered crowd with urgent expressions. David held Amelia close as they approached, his eyes never leaving Mark, who now stood slightly off to the side, his stance rigid and defensive. Amelia whimpered as the paramedics gently inspected her arm, their hands careful but quick, assessing the wounds with practiced precision. One of the paramedics, a calm-faced woman named Sarah, spoke softly to Amelia, her voice soothing. "Sweetheart, we're going to take you to the hospital to clean up these bites, okay? You're very brave." Amelia nodded, her tear-streaked face pale as she clutched her father's hand. David, watching her fear and pain, felt his anger intensify. His gaze moved back to Mark, whose defensive expression seemed to harden under David's scrutiny. David straightened, his jaw clenched. "This is beyond unacceptable," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority he'd honed over years as a captain. "You set your dog on a child. Mark, my child. What on earth were you thinking?" Mark's face contorted in frustration. He shifted uncomfortably as he struggled to justify his actions, muttering under his breath, "She looked suspicious, and I was following protocol. She was running around alone, and I didn't know if she was causing trouble." David's voice dropped, a dangerous calm lacing his words. "She's 6 years old. 6. Chasing a toy plane." His words were biting, each one underscoring the absurdity of Mark's claim. The crowd murmured in agreement, the people growing bolder, voices rising in support of David's condemnation. "You don't get it," Mark insisted, his voice betraying his growing unease. "You weren't here. It looked suspicious, and I thought." "You thought wrong," David cut in, his voice sharp enough to make Mark flinch. "And now my daughter is hurt because you acted on a gut feeling instead of thinking rationally." He turned away from Mark, dismissing him with an icy glance, and focused on comforting Amelia as the paramedics prepared her for transport. As they lifted Amelia onto the stretcher, she reached out to her father, her small fingers grasping his hand with surprising strength. "Daddy, don't leave me," she whispered, her voice shaking. David's heart clenched. He gently squeezed her hand, leaning close to her ear. "I'm coming with you, sweetheart. I won't leave you. I promise." A police sergeant, Officer Linda Harper, arrived on the scene as the ambulance doors closed, her expression grave as she approached David. She was one of David's trusted colleagues and had heard the commotion over the radio. Now, seeing David's haunted expression and the distress surrounding the scene, she understood the severity of the situation. "Captain Johnson," she said, her voice low but respectful, "I'm here to assist in any way I can." David nodded, his eyes still dark with fury. "Sergeant Harper, I need a full report on what happened here," he said. "I want every witness statement, every angle of this incident documented." His tone left no room for argument, and Harper nodded, turning to organize the bystanders and take statements. Inside the ambulance, David held Amelia's hand, his presence a source of quiet strength for her as they sped toward the hospital. He knew that Amelia would need him now more than ever, but the thought of what had happened, the raw injustice of it, gnawed at him. How could he, a captain dedicated to protecting the community, have faced such blatant abuse of power from one of his own? As the ambulance raced through the city streets, David's phone buzzed with notifications. News of the incident was already spreading, the video captured by bystanders circulating on social media. Headlines like "Police Dog Attacks Young Black Girl in Park" and "Police Officer Allows Dog to Bite Child on Command" blared from his screen. It was all happening so fast, the weight of public outrage beginning to build, but David's primary concern was Amelia. Arriving at the hospital, David carried her inside, the nurses quickly taking her under their care. He stayed with her, his presence unwavering, as the doctors cleaned and dressed her wounds. Amelia clung to his hand, her small body trembling, though she tried to be brave. "Is the dog coming back, Daddy?" she asked softly, her eyes wide with fear. David brushed a tear from her cheek, forcing a reassuring smile. "No, sweetheart, Zeus isn't coming back, and he won't hurt you again. I'll make sure of it." As the doctors worked on Amelia, David's thoughts returned to Mark. This wasn't just about one officer's poor decision. It was about the underlying rot in a system that could enable such behavior. He knew he had to stand up against this, not just for Amelia, but for every child, every person who had ever been hurt by the misuse of authority. When Amelia finally fell asleep, exhausted from the day's events, David stepped outside, his mind whirring with questions. He needed answers, accountability, and he needed to ensure that Mark would face the full consequences of his actions. His phone buzzed again. It was a call from Linda Harper. "Captain Johnson," Harper began, her voice hesitant but steady. "We've gathered several witness statements and multiple videos of the incident. The public reaction is, well, it's bad, sir. People are demanding accountability." David's jaw tightened. "Good. They should be. I want a full investigation, Linda. Nothing less. And I want Mark's actions scrutinized to the letter." "Yes, sir," she replied. "We've already forwarded the videos to Internal Affairs. Given the media coverage, this will escalate quickly. I'll keep you updated." David thanked her and hung up, his thoughts churning as he considered his next steps. He knew that Mark's actions were inexcusable, and he'd stop at nothing to ensure justice was served. Back at the precinct, Mark's world was crumbling. He sat in a chair, hands clasped tightly, his mind racing as he realized the gravity of his actions. He was already aware that the incident had gone viral. His face and Zeus's menacing form splashed across every social media platform. The public outcry was growing by the hour, and people he had once worked with were now avoiding his gaze, their silence a form of unspoken condemnation. For Mark, the justifications he had clung to so tightly in the park were now unraveling. He was beginning to see the horror of his actions through the eyes of others, their judgment heavy and unforgiving. He thought of Zeus, the loyal dog he had trained and depended upon, now a symbol of his own recklessness. As the hours ticked by, Mark's defensiveness gave way to a profound unease, a growing understanding that he had crossed a line he could never uncross. Every justification, every defensive thought, fell flat in the face of the girl's innocent terror, her small frame pinned beneath Zeus as the crowd watched in horror. He remembered her cries, the shock on her face, and the look in David's eyes, a look that left no doubt as to the captain's fury. Just then, his phone buzzed. It was an email from Internal Affairs, a summons for a formal investigation into his actions. He felt a cold shiver of dread coursed through him. He would be questioned, scrutinized, every decision dissected, and he would have to answer for every action. Mark's world, once so tightly controlled, was slipping through his fingers, his badge and reputation hanging in the balance. For the first time in his career, he felt truly vulnerable, a realization that chilled him more deeply than he cared to admit. In the hospital, David remained vigilant, his heart heavy with the pain his daughter had endured. As he watched her sleeping form, he made a promise to himself and to Amelia. He would fight for her, ensure that no child, no person, would ever face such terror again at the hands of those meant to protect them. He would expose the abuse, dismantle the toxic behaviors that festered within the ranks, and ensure that Mark faced every consequence of his reckless actions. David leaned over, pressing a gentle kiss to Amelia's forehead as she stirred slightly, her hand reaching out instinctively for his. He took her hand in his, gripping it gently but firmly, his resolve solidified. The journey for justice was just beginning. The battle begins. The morning after the incident, the city was still reeling. News outlets had picked up the story overnight, and headlines blazed across every platform. The public response was swift, and as outrage grew, more voices joined in the call for accountability. People demanded answers, justice, and above all, a clear stance from the city's police department. David knew he had support, but he also knew how difficult it would be to translate that public outcry into tangible change. Back at the police precinct, tension hung thick in the air. The officers who had been David's allies now eyed him with caution, their usual camaraderie replaced with silent wariness. To some, David's pursuit of accountability was a threat, a reminder of the consequences of misusing power. To others, it was a rallying cry, a chance to hold their own accountable and restore public trust. The split in the department was palpable. Linda Harper, the surgeon who had arrived at the park the day before, entered David's office with a stack of reports in hand. Her expression was grim, yet determined, as she placed the files on his desk. "These are the initial statements from yesterday," she said, sitting down across from him. "We have 15 witnesses, all corroborating what we already know." Mark unleashed his dog without any clear threat or warning. He admitted to it himself, but he's already trying to justify it as a misinterpretation of procedure. David clenched his jaw, flipping through the pages, his gaze hardening as he read each statement. It wasn't enough for Mark to admit to his actions. He needed to face the full weight of what he had done. "I want every detail," David said, his voice low and resolute. "The higher-ups will be watching this closely, and I'm not letting this slide. Not this time." Linda nodded, her own resolve matching his. "Captain, you should know," she began carefully. "There's already a pushback brewing. Not everyone's happy about the public attention on this case." David scoffed, his frustration breaking through. "Of course, they aren't. Accountability isn't exactly a popular word around here." He met Linda's gaze, his eyes steely. "But this is different. Amelia is 6 years old, and everyone saw what happened. There's no burying this." As David continued reading through the statements, his phone buzzed with a call from Mayor Evelyn Grant. He took a steadying breath before answering, knowing this was a call he couldn't avoid. "Captain Johnson." The mayor's voice was calm, but carried a hint of urgency. "I wanted to reach out personally regarding the incident with your daughter. First, let me say I'm deeply sorry for what she's gone through. No child should experience that, and as a father, I know this must be profoundly painful." David felt a flicker of appreciation for the mayor's words, but he also sensed the underlying concern for the city's reputation. "Thank you, Mayor Grant. I appreciate your support. Captain, I understand that emotions are high right now, but as you're well aware, the department is facing significant pressure, both from the public and internally. We need to handle this carefully," the mayor continued, her voice diplomatic. David's expression darkened. He understood what she was implying. The city was trying to manage the damage, to keep the department's image intact. But for David, this wasn't about image, it was about justice. "With respect, Mayor," he replied, his tone firm, "this isn't about careful handling. This is about holding an officer accountable for assaulting a child, my daughter. And if we don't handle this openly and honestly, we're setting a dangerous precedent." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. When the mayor spoke again, her tone was softer, as if she recognized his resolve. "I understand, Captain. And as a father, I respect your position. The council will be monitoring the investigation closely. Just make sure you have all the facts before taking further action." David ended the call, feeling the weight settle over him. The system he'd dedicated his life to was now standing in the way of the justice he sought, and the lines between ally and adversary blurred before him. Back at the hospital, Amelia was still recovering, the trauma of the attack leaving her visibly shaken. Nurses and doctors had been working to ease her pain, both physical and emotional, but her spirits remained low. David returned that afternoon, the stress etched into his face as he took a seat by her bed. "Hi, sweetheart," he said softly, brushing a hand over her forehead. "How are you feeling?" Amelia looked up at him, her small face pale and her voice hesitant. "Daddy, why did the dog bite me?" David's heart clenched at her innocent question. How could he explain the complexities of prejudice, power, and abuse to a 6-year-old? How could he tell her that sometimes, even those meant to protect could become a source of harm? "The dog shouldn't have hurt you, Amelia," he said carefully, his voice steady despite the storm within him. "And I promise you, I'm doing everything I can to make sure this doesn't happen again." She seemed to accept this, nodding slowly as she leaned back, her eyelids drooping. She was exhausted, her little body bearing the weight of trauma she didn't yet fully understand. As Amelia drifted off to sleep, David's phone buzzed with another call, this time from Internal Affairs. The lead investigator, Lieutenant Rachel Ortega, was someone David had worked with before, known for her fierce commitment to justice and a reputation for rooting out corruption within the department. Captain Johnson. Rachel's voice was as calm and professional as he remembered. We're launching a formal investigation into Officer Wilson's conduct. I'd like to meet with you tomorrow morning to discuss the case and gather your statement. David's grip tightened on the phone. Of course, Lieutenant. I'll be there. After ending the call, he stared out the hospital room window, a mixture of anger and determination filling him. This was his fight now, and he would do whatever it took to bring justice to Amelia. The next day, David arrived at Internal Affairs, a sprawling building filled with officers, investigators, and the quiet hum of tension. He found Rachel Ortega waiting for him in her office, her sharp eyes studying him as he entered. She gestured for him to sit, her face a mask of professionalism. Captain Johnson, she began, opening a file in front of her. First, let me express my condolences for what happened to your daughter. We're committed to conducting a thorough investigation, and I assure you, we'll leave no stone unturned. David nodded, grateful for her words. Thank you, Lieutenant. I appreciate your dedication. Rachel leaned forward, her expression serious. David, I want you to understand something. This case isn't going to be easy. There's a lot of pushback from certain members of the department, people who feel that Officer Wilson's actions are being overblown or taken out of context. They're saying he made a judgment call, and they're pressuring me to consider the larger picture. David's jaw tightened. The larger picture. He echoed, his voice filled with disbelief. This is about an officer attacking a child. My child, without cause or justification. What more context do they need? Rachel's gaze softened. I agree with you, David, but you and I both know that the department has its own politics, its own agendas. You're not just fighting Mark Wilson here. You're up against a system that resists accountability at every turn. David felt the weight of her words. He had spent years working within this system, believing that it could be a force for good. But now he was beginning to see the rot within, the deeply entrenched power structures that shielded officers from consequences. What are our options? He asked, his voice steady but laced with frustration. Rachel sighed, flipping through the file. We have a strong case based on witness statements and video evidence, but if you want real accountability, we may need to take this public. The media is already involved, and public pressure might be our only leverage. David considered her words, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He knew that going public would escalate things, potentially isolating him further from the department and putting a target on his back. But he also knew that if he didn't act, Mark would walk away unscathed, and Amelia's trauma would go unaddressed. He met Rachel's gaze, his resolve hardening. Do it. Bring it to the public. Let the city see what happened and demand answers. I'm not backing down. Rachel nodded, a flicker of admiration in her eyes. All right, Captain. I'll start arranging the press briefing and ensure that every angle of this case is scrutinized. I won't let them silence us. As David left the Internal Affairs office, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The path ahead would be challenging, filled with obstacles and backlash from those who sought to protect their own interests. But he would press on, driven by a fierce love for his daughter and a commitment to the principles he had once sworn to uphold. This was no longer just about justice for Amelia. It was about dismantling a culture that valued authority over accountability, power over protection. And as he walked out into the bright afternoon sunlight, he knew that he was ready to face whatever lay ahead, for her sake, and for the future she deserved. Standing in the crossfire, the decision to take the case public was like setting off a firestorm. Within hours, news of the press briefing scheduled by Internal Affairs began circulating online, sparking discussions across social media, radio stations, and local television channels. Pundits and news anchors debated the incident, each attempting to dissect what had happened and assign blame. The story was no longer just about a police officer, his dog, and a young girl. It had become a symbol of a much larger issue, a struggle for accountability within law enforcement that resonated far beyond city limits. Meanwhile, David's phone buzzed nonstop with calls, texts, and emails. Support from community groups, activists, and old friends poured in, but so did backlash from those who felt he was betraying the badge. Some questioned his loyalty to the department, calling him out publicly for pushing an anti-police narrative. Others went further, sending him messages filled with vitriol and threats. It was as if he had become a lightning rod, attracting the rage and frustration of people on both sides of the issue. Late one evening, David sat at his kitchen table, sifting through the messages on his phone. His face was lined with exhaustion, his eyes haunted from sleepless nights spent reliving the moment Zeus had attacked Amelia. He scrolled through message after message, noting how quickly the conversation had spiraled from Amelia's pain to a national debate. "What happened to our family?" A message from an unknown number read, "You used to be one of us, Captain. Now you're siding with the people who hate us." David exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. It was infuriating, seeing how people twisted the situation, how they reduced Amelia's suffering to a political agenda. This wasn't about loyalty to the badge or the department. It was about protecting the very people the department was supposed to serve. A faint sound made him look up. Amelia stood in the doorway, her small frame silhouetted against the hallway light, her face shadowed and uncertain. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice laced with hesitation. David's heart softened immediately. He set his phone down and opened his arms, and she climbed into his lap, wrapping her tiny arms around his neck. He held her close, her presence grounding him, reminding him of the real reason behind his fight. "Can you stay with me tonight?" she asked softly, looking up at him with big tear-filled eyes. "I'm scared." David nodded, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Of course, sweetheart. I'm here. I'll always be here." Amelia leaned against his chest, closing her eyes as he held her. He could feel her small body relax, but he knew the trauma lingered. The nightmares were frequent, and her once carefree spirit was now shadowed by fear. She barely ventured outdoors, flinching at the sound of barking dogs and staying close to him whenever they went out. David had made the decision to keep her home from school for now, arranging for a private tutor to help her continue her studies. But every day she asked if she could go back, and every day he felt the pang of guilt that this one incident had stolen her innocence. The day of the press briefing dawned gray and drizzly, as if the city itself sensed the gravity of what was about to unfold. David arrived at the downtown press center, a sprawling building often used for major city announcements. He was flanked by Linda Harper and a few other allies who had come to show their support. Lieutenant Rachel Ortega was already there, her face a mask of determination as she went over her notes one last time. Inside, the room buzzed with reporters, cameras, and flashes of light. Journalists from local and national media outlets jostled for position, eager to catch the latest development in a story that had captivated the public. Their murmurs filled the room, their questions poised and ready as they prepared to capture every moment. As David stepped onto the stage with Rachel by his side, a hush fell over the crowd. His eyes swept over the sea of faces, the tension palpable. This wasn't just another case. This was an opportunity to confront the broken systems that allowed abuse to thrive within institutions meant to protect. Rachel cleared her throat and leaned into the microphone. "Good morning, and thank you all for being here. We are gathered today to address a serious incident involving Officer Mark Wilson and Captain David Johnson's daughter, Amelia Johnson. Our department is fully committed to investigating this matter and ensuring that justice is served." She paused, allowing the gravity of her words to sink in. Cameras flashed, capturing the intensity in her expression. "As the lead investigator," she continued, "I can confirm that we have reviewed substantial evidence, including witness statements and video footage, which clearly indicate Officer Wilson's unprovoked decision to release his dog on a child. This was not a matter of protocol. It was a blatant abuse of authority." Murmurs rippled through the crowd as reporters scribbled furiously. One journalist raised his hand, and Rachel nodded for him to proceed. "Lieutenant Ortega, He began, "What can you tell us about the department's response to this case? There are rumors that certain factions within the force are trying to downplay the incident. Are you facing internal opposition?" Rachel's expression hardened, and she glanced briefly at David before responding. "Our commitment to transparency and accountability is unwavering. While we cannot deny that there are differing perspectives within the department, our duty is to the public and to justice. We will not be swayed by internal politics or personal agendas." David felt a surge of respect for Rachel. She had taken a considerable risk by standing alongside him, challenging the culture of silence that had shielded officers from accountability for so long. This fight was as personal for her as it was for him, and he knew she was putting her career on the line. As the questioning continued, another journalist raised a hand. "Captain Johnson, do you believe that this case will lead to lasting changes within the police department? And are you prepared for the backlash that may come from fellow officers?" David stepped forward, his gaze steady as he looked into the sea of cameras and faces. "Change doesn't come without sacrifice," he began, his voice unwavering. "I've served in this department for over 20 years, and I've always believed that our mission is to protect and serve. But when one of our own betrays that mission, when they hurt those we are sworn to protect, it's our duty to hold them accountable." He paused, the weight of his words settling over the crowd. "This isn't just about one incident. It's about the culture we uphold. If we turn a blind eye, if we allow actions like this to go unpunished, then we are complicit in every future abuse of power. I'm prepared to face whatever backlash comes my way, because my daughter deserves justice, and so does every other person who has ever felt fear instead of safety when they looked at us." The room was silent, a palpable tension hanging in the air as the reporters absorbed his words. David's statement had touched a nerve, challenging not only the department but the broader culture of authority that often protected its own over the public. As he stepped back, Rachel addressed the crowd once more, detailing the next steps of the investigation and emphasizing the department's commitment to transparency. The briefing concluded, and as they stepped off the stage, David felt a sense of catharsis, a release of the frustration and anger that had been building within him since the incident. But he knew this was only the beginning. The fight ahead would be grueling, and he would need every ounce of strength he had. Outside the press center, protesters had gathered, some holding signs supporting David and demanding justice for Amelia, while others stood in opposition, accusing him of betraying the department. The division was stark, the lines drawn clearly between those who wanted change and those who clung to the status quo. As David exited the building, a woman approached him, holding a sign that read, "Justice for Amelia." Her eyes were filled with compassion and understanding, and she reached out to place a comforting hand on his arm. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Thank you for standing up for what's right." David nodded, his voice choked with emotion. "Thank you for being here. It means a lot to know people care." The crowd around them buzzed with energy, their voices blending into a powerful hum of solidarity and dissent. But David felt a glimmer of hope amidst the chaos. He knew he was no longer alone in his fight. As he returned home that evening, David found Amelia waiting for him, her eyes brightening as he walked through the door. She ran to him, wrapping her arms around his waist, and he lifted her into his arms, holding her close. "I missed you, Daddy," she whispered. David kissed her forehead, his heart swelling with love and purpose. "I missed you too, sweetheart, and I'm going to make sure that what happened to you never happens to anyone else." He knew that the path ahead would be fraught with challenges, that he would face betrayal, disappointment, and moments of doubt. But as he held Amelia in his arms, he felt a renewed strength, a resolve that went beyond duty or career. This was about something much deeper, something worth every sacrifice he would make. With Amelia by his side, he was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that he was fighting for something far greater than himself. A fractured brotherhood. The days following the press briefing were a blur of tension, stress, and fatigue. Every action David took was scrutinized by the department, the public, and the media. News outlets dissected every word he had spoken, every action he had taken, analyzing and reanalyzing his motivations. David knew he had put himself and his family in the spotlight, and with it came a new level of exposure he had not fully anticipated. While some officers respected his stance, others saw him as a threat to the integrity of the department, believing he was fanning the flames of anti-police sentiment. David had been receiving anonymous threats, thinly veiled messages accusing him of betrayal and cowardice. Many came from unknown numbers, the messages short but laced with venom. One night, as he read through the latest set of threatening messages, his phone buzzed with a notification from an unfamiliar number. "Watch your back, Captain. We know where you live." David felt a chill as he read the message. The words were few but pointed, and he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just an empty threat. The department had always been his second family, a source of support and camaraderie. But now, with his decision to pursue justice against one of their own, that bond felt as fragile as glass. He couldn't be sure who he could trust anymore. The next morning, David arrived at the precinct, his jaw set as he walked through the halls, feeling the weight of each sideways glance from his colleagues. Conversations halted as he passed, officers shifting awkwardly as he made his way to his office. The camaraderie he once shared with them was now laced with suspicion, distrust, and bitterness. As David reached his office, Linda Harper was waiting for him, a concerned look on her face. She closed the door behind him, leaning against it, her arms crossed. "David," she began, her voice low, "you need to be careful. People are talking. They think you're bringing unnecessary heat onto the department." David sat down at his desk, his face etched with frustration. "Since when is demanding accountability considered unnecessary heat, Linda?" He replied, his tone edged with exhaustion. "This isn't just about one officer. This is about doing what's right, for my daughter, for everyone." Linda sighed, crossing the room to sit across from him. "I know, David. I support you, and there are others who do too. But you're also making enemies. There are people who feel you're throwing them under the bus, who see your actions as a betrayal." David scoffed, his anger simmering beneath the surface. "I didn't betray them. They betrayed the badge. They betrayed the trust that people put in us to protect, not harm." Linda's expression softened, and she reached out to place a reassuring hand on his. "Just be careful, all right? There are people out there who won't let this go." He nodded, though the bitterness remained, his heart heavy with the burden of isolation. Linda's support meant a lot, but the loss of trust among his colleagues was cutting deeper than he cared to admit. Outside the precinct, the protests had continued to grow, some in support of David's stance, others rallying against what they saw as an attack on the police force. Community leaders, activists, and concerned citizens had joined the protests, calling for transparency and reform within the department. One group of supporters, led by a well-known civil rights activist named Naomi Harris, had been particularly vocal, organizing rallies, distributing flyers, and meeting with city officials to demand justice for Amelia. Naomi was a fierce advocate for accountability, a voice of reason and determination amid the noise. David had never met her in person, but he'd heard about her from Linda, who knew Naomi from community outreach initiatives. As he left the precinct one evening, exhausted and drained, he saw her speaking with a group of supporters across the street. She caught his eye, nodding in a show of solidarity, and he felt a flicker of gratitude. In a world that seemed to be turning against him, she was a steady source of support. Naomi approached him later that night, after most of the protesters had dispersed. She extended her hand, a warm smile softening her otherwise stern expression. "Captain Johnson, I'm Naomi Harris. I wanted to thank you personally for your courage. You've set a precedent that few would dare to, especially from within the department." David shook her hand, his exhaustion momentarily lifted by her words. "Thank you, Naomi. I appreciate everything you've been doing. It's been a difficult road." She nodded, her expression understanding. I can only imagine. But know this, you're not alone. The community is behind you, and we're going to make sure that justice for Amelia becomes a catalyst for lasting change. They spoke for a while longer, sharing stories, frustrations, and hopes for a better system. For the first time in days, David felt a sense of hope, a glimmer of light amid the darkness. As they parted ways, he promised himself he would fight, not just for Amelia, but for everyone who had been failed by the system he had once trusted so blindly. The next morning, David found himself summoned to a disciplinary hearing with Chief Thomas Boyd, a man whose reputation for strict, no-nonsense leadership was well known. Chief Boyd had overseen the department for over 20 years, his tenure marked by both respect and fear among the ranks. David knew that the chief's loyalty to the department was unwavering, and he braced himself for the conversation that was about to unfold. Boyd's office was large and meticulously organized, every item placed with precision, from the certificates on the walls to the polished desk at the center. Boyd sat behind it, his expression unreadable as he gestured for David to sit. "Captain Johnson," he began, his tone neutral. "You've put me in a difficult position." David nodded, his gaze steady. "I understand that, sir, but I'm doing what I believe is right." The chief's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. "Right or wrong, Captain, you've brought the entire department under scrutiny. Your decision to go public with this case has stirred up more controversy than you realize. We are now facing threats, public distrust, and a fractured team, all because you chose to act unilaterally." David took a deep breath, his frustration simmering. "With respect, Chief Boyd, I didn't make this decision lightly. My daughter was attacked by one of our own, unprovoked. The public has a right to know, and the department has a duty to hold that officer accountable." Boyd's expression darkened, his voice lowering to a menacing tone. "And you believe that sacrificing the department's integrity is worth it? You think you can turn on your own and still call yourself one of us?" David's hands clenched as he struggled to keep his composure. "With all due respect, sir, it's the lack of accountability that's damaging our integrity, not my actions. I didn't turn on the department. I'm holding us to the standards we're supposed to uphold." Boyd sat back, his gaze cold and calculating. "Be that as it may, your actions have consequences. I'm placing you on administrative leave, effective immediately. Consider this time to reevaluate your loyalties." The words hit David like a punch to the gut. Administrative leave was a calculated move, one that stripped him of his authority and isolated him from the investigation. He'd anticipated some backlash, but this felt like a betrayal, a blatant attempt to silence him. As he stood, his voice steady but laced with hurt, he met Boyd's gaze. "You may think this will silence me, Chief, but you're mistaken. I'm not stopping until justice is served, for my daughter and for everyone who's been wronged by this system." Boyd's expression remained impassive, but there was a flicker of something, anger or perhaps respect, as he nodded curtly. "Dismissed, Captain." Leaving the precinct, David felt the weight of isolation settling on his shoulders. He was now effectively cut off from the investigation, his authority diminished, and his future uncertain. But as he stepped into the street, he noticed a small group of protesters holding signs of support, Naomi Harris among them. They noticed him and broke into applause, their voices shouting words of encouragement. One of the protesters handed him a flyer that read, "Justice for Amelia. Stand with Captain Johnson." David's eyes misted as he looked at the group, their determination and unwavering support a balm to his wounded spirit. Naomi stepped forward, a fierce look of pride in her eyes. "We're with you, Captain," she said firmly. "This fight is bigger than one person, and we won't back down." David nodded, his resolve hardening once more. He knew now that he would have to continue this fight outside the confines of the department, that the true battle would be waged in the streets, in the community, and in the court of public opinion. The weight of responsibility pressed on him, but as he looked into the faces of those who supported him, He knew he was ready to face whatever lay ahead. That evening, as he returned home, Amelia ran to him, her small arms wrapping around his waist. He knelt, looking into her eyes, filled with the innocence and trust that had been so brutally shaken. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice small, "did you make them understand?" David hugged her tightly, his voice thick with emotion. "Not yet, sweetheart, but I'm going to keep trying. I promise." As he held her, he felt a renewed strength surging within him. The fight was only beginning, but with Amelia as his anchor and the community standing beside him, he knew he could face whatever obstacles lay ahead. This wasn't just about one case. It was a battle for justice, integrity, and the future he wanted to build, for Amelia, for every child, for every person who deserved to live without fear of those sworn to protect them. And as he looked into his daughter's trusting eyes, he knew that no matter the cost, he would not rest until justice was truly served. The verdict of truth. The courtroom was filled to capacity, the air thick with anticipation. For weeks, the city had watched David Johnson's fight for justice unfold, and now the final chapter was about to play out. Reporters, activists, and concerned citizens filled the benches, their eyes fixed on the front of the room where David sat beside his attorney, Rachel Ortega. Though she was not acting in her capacity as an investigator today, Rachel had taken David's case pro bono, a testament to her commitment to truth and justice. Sitting across from them, Mark Wilson's defense team was visibly tense, their faces set with the confidence of seasoned attorneys, but betrayed by the occasional darting glance toward the jury box. Mark himself sat stoically, though there was an undeniable hint of nervousness in his posture. The gravity of his actions, once dismissed as protocol, now loomed over him, the outcome of the trial holding the potential to reshape his life forever. At the center of it all was Judge Leonard Mendez, a man known for his no-nonsense approach to justice and his unflinching stance on accountability. His mere presence commanded respect, and he held the courtroom in his steady gaze, the weight of responsibility resting on his shoulders as he prepared to oversee the case that had gripped the city. As the proceedings began, Rachel took the stand, her voice steady and clear as she laid out the facts of the case. She meticulously recounted the events of that fateful day, weaving the testimonies of witnesses and the video evidence into a powerful narrative that exposed Mark's reckless behavior. On that day, Rachel addressed the jury, her voice firm but passionate. Officer Wilson's actions weren't merely an error in judgment. They were a gross abuse of power, driven by prejudice and unchecked authority. His decision to unleash his dog on a defenseless child was not just reckless, it was an attack on the very values our community stands for. No child should have to bear the scars of such cruelty, and today, we seek justice for Amelia Johnson. Her words echoed through the silent room, and David felt a surge of pride. Rachel's voice was like a lifeline, her conviction and determination pulling him back from the exhaustion and disillusionment that had nearly consumed him. She was fighting not just for him, but for Amelia and every family that had been affected by the abuse of authority. Mark's defense team, led by a polished attorney named Arthur Grant, attempted to paint a different picture. They argued that Mark had been following procedure, that he had acted based on reasonable suspicion, and that his actions, while unfortunate, were not criminal. "Officer Wilson is a man dedicated to his duty," Arthur said, his voice smooth and measured. "He made a judgment call under circumstances that, in hindsight, may have been flawed. But that does not make him a criminal. It makes him human." David clenched his fists, anger bubbling up as he listened to the defense twist the events, reducing Amelia's pain to an unfortunate consequence of Mark's human error. He wanted to stand up and shout, to demand that they acknowledge the reality of his daughter's suffering, but he forced himself to remain calm. Rachel had assured him that the truth would prevail, that the justice system, flawed though it was, would bring accountability. Over the next few days, witnesses took the stand, each recounting what they had seen. Parents described their horror as they watched Zeus pounce on Amelia, the helplessness they felt as she cried out for help. A jogger who had captured the video footage testified, his voice shaking as he described how he had instinctively pulled out his phone, unable to look away from the brutality of the scene unfolding before him. When David himself took the stand, he spoke with a raw honesty that left the courtroom silent. He described the pain of seeing his daughter's innocence shattered, the anger and helplessness that had driven him to pursue this fight. But he also spoke of his commitment to justice, of the values he had once believed in, and now sought to defend in the face of betrayal. "My daughter was hurt by someone she should have been able to trust," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion coursing through him. "As a father, as a police captain, it is my duty to ensure that what happened to her doesn't happen to anyone else. This isn't just about Amelia. It's about holding ourselves to a higher standard, about making sure that those who wield power do so with responsibility and integrity." As David left the stand, he saw Naomi Harris in the gallery, her eyes brimming with pride and support. She had been instrumental in mobilizing the community, organizing rallies, and amplifying Amelia's story. The impact of her efforts was evident in the diverse crowd seated in the courtroom, a powerful symbol of the solidarity that had formed around David's cause. As the trial drew to a close, both sides presented their final arguments, each making the case for justice as they saw it. When the jury retired to deliberate, the tension in the room was nearly unbearable. David sat in silence, his hands clenched as he stared straight ahead, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. This was the culmination of months of pain, sacrifice, and resilience, and he knew that whatever the verdict, his life, and Amelia's, would never be the same. After hours of deliberation, the jury finally returned, their faces solemn as they took their seats. Judge Mendez addressed the courtroom, his voice calm but carrying the weight of the moment. "Members of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" The foreman, a middle-aged man with a thoughtful expression, stood, holding a folded piece of paper. "We have, Your Honor." As he read the verdict, the room fell into a hushed silence. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Officer Mark Wilson, guilty of reckless endangerment and abuse of authority." The words reverberated through the room, and for a moment, David felt as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. A sense of justice washed over him, bittersweet but undeniable. The verdict wasn't just a victory for Amelia. It was a statement, a call for accountability, a reminder that no one was above the law. Mark's face fell, his expression a mixture of shock and disbelief as he processed the verdict. The defense team looked stunned, their carefully crafted arguments dismantled by the jury's decision. Judge Mendez addressed the court, announcing the sentencing date, and as he banged his gavel, the courtroom erupted in whispers, a mixture of relief and satisfaction filling the air. David turned to Rachel, his eyes brimming with gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I couldn't have done this without you." Rachel gave him a small smile, her own eyes shining. "This was a fight worth fighting, David. You did this for Amelia, and for every person who's ever been hurt by the misuse of power. The department has a long way to go, but this is a step in the right direction." As David left the courthouse, he was met by a crowd of supporters, their cheers filling the air as they held up signs that read, "Justice for Amelia, and no justice, no peace." Naomi stepped forward, embracing him with a warmth that felt like a balm to his wounded spirit. "You did it, David," she said, her voice filled with pride. "You've given us all hope." David nodded, his heart full of gratitude for the community that had stood by him. But as he looked around at the faces of those who had supported him, he realized that this fight had been about more than just one case. It was about a movement, a call for accountability that had been simmering for years and was now finally coming to light. When he returned home that night, he found Amelia waiting for him, her eyes wide with curiosity. She had been too young to fully understand the trial, but she knew that her father had been fighting for her, that he had faced great challenges to protect her. "Daddy," she asked softly, "are the bad guys gone now?" David knelt down, wrapping his arms around her as he spoke with gentle honesty. "Not all of them, sweetheart, but we're one step closer to making things right." As he held her, he felt a sense of peace settle over him, a feeling he hadn't known in months. The journey had been long and painful, but he had stayed true to his principles, and in the process, he had helped ignite a movement for change. In the days that followed, the city felt the ripple effects of the trial's outcome. Community leaders and activists used the momentum to push for reforms, calling for transparency, accountability, and a reimagining of the police force's role in the community. David found himself at the forefront of this movement, a reluctant but determined leader, using his experience to advocate for a system that upheld justice and compassion. For Amelia, the scars of that day in the park would take time to heal, but with her father's love and the support of those around her, she found the strength to face her fears. And as she grew older, she would come to understand the significance of her father's fight, the legacy of courage and integrity he had left for her and for future generations. David's journey had changed him, reshaping his beliefs, his purpose, and his understanding of justice. He had faced betrayal, isolation, and unimaginable challenges, but he had emerged stronger, guided by a commitment to truth and a love for his daughter that nothing could shake. As he stood at the edge of the crowd during a rally, watching as the community gathered to demand change, David felt a renewed sense of purpose. This fight was far from over, but he was ready to face it head-on, knowing that his voice, and the voices of those who stood beside him, would be the force that carried them toward a brighter, more just future.